Hello, I've been looking forward to this. The immediate rules question and procedural advice I have concerns price. Now, price is actually incredibly important, but if you talk about it like it's important, then it becomes too dedicated for the discussion. People become too invested in all the details and get confused because so many things come together in just that one little number, which is, in most cases, just minus one die. So, to keep it easy as well as simple, go ahead and just find out from each player what is her character bad at or harmed by as a direct result of practicing sorcery. Bear in mind that these are situational problems. They are not just descriptive details like I have a scar, or I had to sacrifice my little finger, or I feel bad about something, or anything like that. Just if they say something like that, extend it into being bad at something because of it. Whether it could be very, very simple, simply that I don't run well, or it could be something more like I lose my temper easily, or anything of the kind. And don't lock down all the legalities. As a game master, write down situations that to you seem just right. You would say, oh, well, when somebody disagrees forcefully or something like that. And just leave it at that. It doesn't have to be any more complicated. So that's price, which is a very small thing in so many ways, and so amazing the way that it grabs all the other pieces of the character at once. Let's take a look now at the more complicated situation of building the demons. And this is, of course, fun as anything for me, especially in light of my recent work on champions. It's remarkable to be looking back at those texts which taught me how to do what I'm talking about in Sorcerer. And so the first one I'll address is something that seems common to all of them. They all have some way of influencing an attacker in some indirect way, so that the attacker's the attempt against the character is spoiled. Well, I have a different way to do that for each demon, going by the precise phrasing that you provided, but I want to give a backup ability for each one. And think of this as the end stage of the ability in action. So each demon, does what the player said, but part of doing that also provides armor for the character, which means that the attack, if it does get past that first line of defense, is at least unable to inflict lethal harm. So even if the demon can't fully stop the attacker, because nothing is guaranteed in Sorcerer, then the armor effect will indeed keep the character from taking as much damage or damage of a certain kind as they would. So first and foremost, let's just give each of the demons this armor, not because they have armor or like clothe the character in clanking armor or anything like that, but because in case of an incoming attack, no matter what, if it's not fully stopped, then it will at least be minimized in terms of its impact. So that's the first idea. Now let's take a look at them individually. Looking at Amy's demons, we talk about, I'm going straight from what the sheet says, and clearly travel for going through the walls, cloak and daze together work very, very nicely for invisibility, because that provides immense advantages in any situation where there's a role to perceive the character, and the cloak sets up a bunch of circumstances under which perception to see them in the first place is required when otherwise it wouldn't be. So together, you want invisibility, get cloak and daze, have them work together, and that'll pretty much take care of what you need. Now, for the protection, then First, according to this demon, perceiving the imminent danger, because this was the most direct one, perceiving the imminent danger is very important. And the retaliatory power is hold, which, as written, is kind of like being, wrapped in a tentacle or a spider's web or something and being all immobilized. But if you look at it a little bit more carefully, just the inability to get an action off in the way that they want, even if it doesn't last very long, and it lasts a little bit longer than another power called Confuse that I was considering, in that the character is the attacker is very much impaired from continuing to, instead of just a momentary hesitation, they've actually got to overcome something in order to do that. The fact that it is handled by stamina instead of will is of no interest whatsoever. Just treat it with the stamina and you'll be fine. Thinking of that as the attacker's intended physicality that is really being hampered. So all that business about influencing their mind only becomes narration, only becomes a matter of special effect. Remember, in Sorcerer, there are no puppeteer mind control abilities. So therefore, if you want to have something like that in your game, all you have to do is think of the effects that such control would force, and in which this case is very clear, and then just have the abilities that do that be the effects of such an action. So far for that demon, we're talking about travel, cloak, daze, perception, hold, and armor. So that's 6 abilities, which puts lore for that demon at 6, and therefore power must be equivalent to the highest, but will has to be the highest. So will is at least 7, and power therefore is at least 7. Let's turn to Malika's demon. And here the demon is a little subtler, a little more knowledge-based, a little clue finder. Clues are always problematic in role-playing and present certain whole discussion points. But in this case, there are things that ordinary forensics can't do. And perception is the way to go for such activities in the kind of stories that Sorcerer is most inspired by. I kind of made suggestions. I thought of 2 different perception abilities. One of them is to be in a location and be able to perceive events in the past in that location. And the other one is to be interacting with a person and to be able to see events committed or actions committed by that person in the past. Keeping those pretty specific is a good idea, instead of just learn anything and everything. By looking at it, have it be something pretty specific like that, but very, very handy, and yet open to either misinterpretation and also open to lack of other knowledge to keep things interesting. So that's the first thing for Malika's demon, are those 2 perceptions, or any set of perception that's like that. I added a hint as well. I think of that as sort of the big, the dangerous double-edged sword weapon problem ability. It's not something that a player is really going to want to do very often, but for things that are absolutely crucial, that they don't mind endangering their character's own mind and body, I often have had it done through relatively informal role-playing, that they're pushing for more information, pushing the demon's abilities, trying to really get those ordinary abilities that they're using all the time to get them further deeper into the situation than they have played previously. And then I say, you really want to push this, you can go into more dangerous territory with this. And if they say yes, then I apply the hint ability, which I've provided to the demon for just such an eventuality. And then we have the other aspects of that demon. Yes, here's where the confuse ability is much more appropriate, where the target of, or rather the attacking person who becomes the target of the demon's protective abilities, is simply one step behind the demon. And that's why fast and confuse working together are very, very effective for the player character simply to be exactly where the attacking character isn't. And again, we're kind of tweaking the definition a little bit because we're talking about the attacker's own capacity to attack, or intentions being at least distorted enough momentarily that they can't do it. And both fast and confuse working together can be maintained very nicely as kind of a blanket environment for attackers regarding this character. So that's quite handy too. And then we also have the backup with the armor. So that's 6 abilities as well. 2 perceptions, hint, fast, confuse, and the armor. Then finally, Ileana's demon. And I beg to differ about the possessor. The phrase that the player used is "in my body," and I believe "parasite" is probably more appropriate. The tricky thing about a parasite is that it gives the player the user status for all of the powers, and so you might want to check that with the player to see to quote the sheet, if somebody threatens me, he seduces him or influences him to avoid me. So talking about the demon as the agent, but then looking at the character's description, it's not inconceivable that those actions on the demon's part are actually instituted through the behavior of the sorceress. That seems actually to make a lot of sense when I read those power descriptions in conjunction with the player's description of the character. So let's stick with parasite rather than possessor. It makes a lot more sense. That doesn't necessarily mean that the demon is corporeal, like a bug living in them. That's never has been an issue. A parasite or a possessor can be physically conceived in any imaginable way, whether ethereal or anatomical or whatever. So taking a look at the powers. Now, this one's going to be a little bit kind of interesting because we have a vague statement like "protects my body," and looking at the description of protection, it's actually extremely open-ended. It talks about any attack besides absolutely direct harm of very physical kind, like a bullet or a knife or something, or being beaten with fists. Anything else protection can handle. And in this case, restraint of any kind seems absolutely appropriate. That the character has all these protection dice to use when it comes to anything attacking along those lines. And if you add travel with an eye toward escape, that the character is extremely good at whatever physical travel is necessary or possible for purpose of avoiding this kind of restraint, that's great. You now have it. Between those 2 abilities, you have basically an ungrabbable, very hard to threaten character in terms of controlling their movement or stopping them from doing things. As far as the seduction or influence to stop somebody from directly harming her, there's the armor as the backup, which is probably the strongest to use. Just thinking about this particular demon and perhaps trying a bit to use different abilities for the different demons, which you don't have to. I was also thinking in terms of psychic force for this demon, because that kind of attack is very good at bumping people off of whatever it was they were attempting to do. And can be defined in many, many different ways, whether you just distract them, whether you actually hit them with a psychic blow. Anything of the kind is possible. So with a little flexibility toward concept, combining psychic force, protection as I described, travel as I described, and the armor really works out pretty well. Now, what this character needs as well, and it's very important, is a combination of perception of the social expectations that are surrounding her. And the other ability would be cover. Now, looking at the character's own cover, which has to do with, if I'm reading correctly, kind of a social networking, organizing, leading kind of person. And if they're taking it as a cover, then that's a huge part of their overt identity to others and quite likely to themselves. So if you put the demon also has a cover that's very similar, which is the organizer of social events, a social organizer. That means everybody's going to perceive the character as the natural leader in the situation. With the perception of the social expectations in play, then we've got somebody who's always seems to others to know the right thing to say, to take the right tactic, to have done the thing that was best for them to do in that moment. Even if it didn't work out, they could not possibly have done any better. People would continue to admire her almost regardless of the way things are actually turning out. So again, to summarize, psychic force, protection, travel with that escape tweak, perception of the social expectations, and cover and armor, locking it down at 6 abilities. Just kind of a coincidence that I ended up with 6 abilities for each demon concept, but why not? Now, the last thing had to do with the scores themselves. And I agree that it's a little tricky. You don't have your typical role-playing, strength chart. If they're this number means they can lift this many pounds, and if they've, little funny adjectives that go with each value of will and stuff like that. None of those really help during play. So the best thing to do, that's why I don't have them in Sorcerer, but the best thing to do with Sorcerer is to ask each player if their character has any physique, stamina, or will or personality that would be considered very ordinary. And if so, then assign it to either or both of those. If they say, oh, I'm totally ordinary, my body and my mind, the person is not special in terms of, competence, then 2 and 2. That would be fine. Ask if any of them have physique or will and personality that is evidently extraordinary, that they give off an immense impression of competence that they can back up relative to just about anybody in either physique or will and personality. Probably unlikely that they'll pick 5 or pick that for both, but if they do for one of them, then assign it at 5. If they do for both of them, assign each one a 4. So now you're looking at scores for both stamina and for will, whatever they may be. Add them up, and whatever you need to fill it into 10, that's their value for lore. That should work pretty well. There are lots of ways to go about this. You might start with lore, but then people tend to start debating what's the difference between a 3 and a 4, and it's not very helpful. So just go kind of with this blunt instrument I've described for the scores, and that should be fine. Okay, what's left? Oh, yes, kickers. Well, as with all of my advice for your game and the situations you've described and the kind of suggestions that you've made and fought your way through this whole time, I've tuned my answer very carefully to your presentation. The first thing is this. I hope this comes across correctly. Apocalypse World's techniques for how to talk to the players and what to do in terms of them getting involved in their character and playing them more intuitively, well, that's Sorcerer technique. Vincent developed those rules for Apocalypse World very much in the context of learning how to get other people to play Sorcerer. And he has always, to his credit, been very fair about crediting the work of others, how it influenced his work, and this is not a mystery, it's not a secret, I'm not saying it just to whine, but because this is something you're kind of invested in, it may help to know that if you are using Apocalypse World GMing and player interaction techniques when you play Sorcerer, then you're coming by it very honestly, because those techniques from Apocalypse World are kind of a specific filter, a specific perspective on the Sorcerer techniques, and so you'll be fine. They're compatible. It'll work out very, very well. So that's good news. And let's take a look at those characters. One of the neat things about them is that, as far as I can tell, they have kickers already. or very, very close. They only need to be implemented in play with your knowledge that they're going to be quite forceful in their impact upon the character's situation. If we're looking at Amy, then she has this weird court case about the father accused of killing the children with the evidence disappearing. If this happens relatively recently, and you as GM say this is the first day of the rest of this character's life, and not in a good way, then you're all set. That means you have a lot of GM backstory work to do, but that's good. That's fun. Now, the second character, Malika, says that she plotted to destroy her husband's career so that he would become the caretaker at home. And this seems like a pretty Kicker-esque thing to have done. This is something very proactive on this character's part that could have big repercussions. And so you as GM would commit to playing the husband who either is really excited about doing this and is all for it, or perhaps is really curious about how he lost this promising career and is going to take steps to try and find out, or to try to figure out, or to try to start something up on his own. In other words, going to be problematic. So if you do that, particularly if you decide you like the character and play him with some integrity, then I think that we end up with a pretty good kicker for that character as well. Again, straight out of the write-up we already have. Finally, and maybe not as clean, or maybe subject to just the tiniest bit of conversation with the player about it, it says that Ileana destroyed the life of her spouse basically by defaming the guy, completely destroying his reputation, and that this actually could be quite interesting through third parties, people who were committed to the success of that character, people who liked that character, people who will stop at nothing to clear the name, the reputation of that character. So again, more work for you in the backstory, and a lot of attention should be paid to how these are good people, or interesting people, or maybe very bad people, whichever. But you need to make choices about this that make sense to you and that you want to play. This is called spiking the kicker, and it is a huge thing for the game master to take ownership for, and to be committed to, and not to let up. It's not just something the character did or something that happened to the character. This is something that will change the character, the player character's life. That's what a kicker is. Considering all that content, that's already there, you might as well run with it and not have tedious debates or require them to put more and more and more information into the situation. Finally, that leads us a little bit to the techniques that I was talking about from Apocalypse World, where you learned them about playing a day in the life and continuing. And that's great for Sorcerer, as long as it doesn't drag on much. We need to learn a bit about the characters. You said that they already wanted to play some Sorceress ritual work. And you talked as well about the whole, what is it like playing through a little while in the character's ordinary day. I suggest that this is where you ask them directly, what are you doing to provide your demon's need as part of that ordinary day? And I think that all of that sets up very nicely for implementing the effects of the first appearance of the kicker as something very meaningful in the character's situation. So I think all of that will work together very nicely. Anyway, that's that. Brainstorming on my part. Use some or all of it as seems fit to you. What I really want to model for you is not overdoing it, not talking it to death, not negotiating every last bit, not trying to elicit more and more and more information and justification from the player, not wasting any more time, basically, before you just get into those play situations and play it hard. This was very enjoyable. I've really enjoyed reading what you've written. And please, please keep us informed.